Hello everybody, this is General Yanis, and today in Death Card Tactics we are looking at the Rhino, and the question is to take the Rhino or not to take the Rhino. So let's get started. So today the 6th of March, and unfortunately Papa Nurgle has blessed my my family with the pox, the chicken pox. Hopefully, so far none has become a pox walker yet. But focusing on the review at hand, I will be reviewing the Rhino, the trusty transport option that is bubonic Astartes in the Death Card arsenal, and is not a Forge World unit. We will be looking at the stats, the transport capabilities, the durability, and how to use it, or what to think about to achieve an optimal use. And maybe it's especially important the Rhino now that the inexorable advance our Plague Marines or other foot infantry, they can advance inexorably, ignore any modifiers to the move characteristic, but not to their move. So, for example, forests and craters and so on, difficult ground, they cannot pass so easily. But is it worth fielding rhinos, or should we foot slog along? Let's take a look. So let's start with the Rhino stats and abilities and the weapon options. So the Chaos Rhino is dedicated transport with a base cost of 80 points. It has 10 wounds, and therefore it also has brackets. So in the topmost bracket, it has a movement of 12 inch, which is really good for its role as a fast transport device, let's say. It doesn't have basically any weapon skill. Ballistic skill is 3+. Strength 6, toughness 7, 10 wounds, 3 attacks, 8 leadership, and a 3+ save, but it doesn't have any invul save. Importantly, it has the Contagions of Nurgle ability, so it can give the -1 toughness aura, and can also be the target of the flash outbreak to also, let's say, get an aura from a warlord from the same plague company. So this can be quite interesting to spread the contagions with a Rhino as a vessel, let's say. It also has the ability to explode, and on a 6 before anything disembark, if it gets destroyed, it can explode, and units within 6 inches get D3 mortal wounds. If it loses 5 of its 10 wounds or more, then it will start to degrade, and it goes to the next bracket, which is really important here, that it loses a lot of its mobility, so only 6-inch movement. Therefore, basically, its utility, if it's bracketed, is very limited. Let's say then it's not so useful to transport the infantry as good as if it can do it in 12-inch. And then with 1-2 wounds, the movement would only be a 3-inch. The keywords are vehicle, bubonic Astartes, which is quite important for some secondaries. It's transport. It has the smokescreen ability that can help with its durability using a smokescreen stratagem. Death Card, Plague Company, and then Chaos Nurgle and Heretic Astartes. Its transport capacity is 10 Plague Company bubonic Astartes infantry models, and it cannot transport Terminator or possessed models. The weapon choices, with the 80 points, it comes with a standard combi bolter, so just a normal rapid fire 2 weapon. It can get an additional combi bolter for +5 points, so bring it up to 85 points, or it could take a Havoc launcher for 5 points, or it could add a combi weapon option on top, like a combi flamer, combi melta, combi plasma, etc. But this is for 10 more points. So the Chaos Rhino is actually the fastest bubonic Astartes Death Card unit when it's not bracketed, and it has the Contagions of Nurgles. So as I said, interesting target for the flash outbreak. Basically, it can only transport Plague Marines as the main thing, and then it can also carry its supporting characters for the Plague Marines, like Virion, for example, Foul Blightspawn or Biologus, and the Chaos Lord and the Malignant Plaguecaster can also be in the Rhino, but we cannot have any Terminators there, or the Possessed, or other non-infantry things, of course. It has the smokescreen ability to get -1 to hit when we can use the stratagem in the opponent's shooting phase. With the 10 wounds, it can degrade its profile, and also as a vehicle, it can give the opponents 1 victory points for bringing it down. Movement will importantly go down if it's degrade when it loses 5 wounds. it lacks the inval save, and with toughness save 7 only, let's say it's not super durable. It has a few weapon options, and of course it's not a damage dealer, so probably it's best to keep it with a standard combi bolter for the lowest 80 point cost, cheapest option. But if you wanted to add at least one more weapon to make it more, let's say to do a little bit more damage, which one should you choose? So here I'm comparing this the weapon options it has. So here you see the standard Rhino, and here's the damage per 100 points, and then it's the range shooting at 24-inch and 12-inch, long range and short range shooting. The standard with only one combi bolter. Here it has 2 shots, and then in the 12-inch it will have 4 shots. It doesn't have the malicious volley, so it allows us to always rapid fire. If we have 2 combi bolters, we're getting a bit more. But let's say of all the options, the Havoc, combining the standard combi bolter with the Havoc launcher for 5 more points, brings us the best, let's say, shooting at long range, and also quite good at shorter range. So as mentioned, it's probably better to stick with a standard lowest cost Rhino, but if you want to add a bit more damage, then the Havoc launcher seems to be the best option. So it's a cheap blast weapon with a decent range, and the combi weapons that it can take are not so good at, let's say, longer range, because the Melta and the Flamer only work at lower range, and the Plasma only rapid fires, or yeah, the combi weapons only rapid fire at 12-inch range. Here you can see the damage across the targets here. For the long range, where you see the gray is the Havoc launcher. But as of course we said, the Rhino's primary role is not to deal damage, but is to transport infantry and, in essence, Plague Marines faster across the board. So we can take 10 Bubonic as starters, but not Terminators or Possessed. So we could take a Plague Marines plus their support characters, and I already did a video link. I did already a video about a Rhino, a loaded Rhino with 7 Plague Marines, and which would be their optimal. Some considerations who to support them. It could be, for example, also 10 melee-oriented Plague Marines that you want to come up the field quickly and get in close and personal before them. Yeah, instead of foot slogging up the board, you want to deliver them so they can charge and do a lot of damage with their melee weapons. The units, the rules for transports is that the units can start, for example, within the Rhino before deploying. So you declare in the transports phase before the battle starts what units start inside the Rhino. There are, of course, embarkation rules and disembarkation rules. Units can embark transport the Rhino if every model ends its move, albeit a normal advance or fallback move, wholly within 3 inches of the transport, but it cannot do so if they just disembarked and then embark again. And basically you can move a unit close to the Rhino, they can enter, and then the Rhino can move if it didn't move before the embarkation. For disembarking, the unit has to start in the transport model, and it can if it starts there and the transport hasn't moved, it can disembark. And then what you do is you set the unit wholly within 3 inches of the transport and not in engagement range of the enemy. And the disembarking unit can then act normally. It can then move, it can shoot, it can charge, etc. If the transport is destroyed with the units inside, you first resolve any explode ability, and then the units disembark, and you have to roll a d6 for every model. On a 1, a model is slain. And basically it's your choice of which models are removed. So if you have, let's say, a Rhino full of 10 models, you throw 10 dice, and for every ones, which you would probably be getting 1.5 or 2 on average, let's say, or you could be unlucky and get more, you can choose at least choose which models would die, not taking, for example, the support characters. You would probably take the cheapest Plague Marine bolter guys in this case. So thinking about some transportation distances, how much can the Rhino move? So let's think about the scenario where we have the Rhinos and they start the Plague Marines start inside the Rhino, and we get, for example, the first turn. So in our first turn, we could advance the Rhino, its full movement, 12 inches, and the D6. So on average now, our Plague Marines have traveled 15.5 inch between, let's say, 13 and 18 inches, depending on the advance roll. So we have the Rhino quite far in the midfield of the table here. Then we have to wait because we cannot disembark in the same in the first turn where our Rhino has moved. And then in the death card turn 2, if the Rhino was not exploded by this time, then we can disembark the Plague Marines. We set them up within 3 inches, so we can move them basically to 3 inches from the Rhino, and then they can do after that their normal move of 5 inches, so they can move in essence 8 inches away from the Rhino. And then the Rhino can, after everything disembarked, it can continue and move or advance further to do its own job. And then let's say its content is delivered. And basically, if we came around 15.5 inches away from our start position, then with a 3-inch plus 5-inch, our Plague Marines are now 23.5 inches on average. Let's say basically, depending on the advance roll, between 21 and 26 inches from where the Rhino started. And then if we assume that there are some enemies, let's say we can make a charge roll of 7-inch. Further away from here, we could have on turn 2 already have moved our Plague Marines around 30 inches on the table. We could also make a larger charge roll or whatever, but just for reference here. And this is if nothing happens to the Rhino. In another scenario, if our Rhino is we can still advance it in the first turn, let's say, but then the Rhino is destroyed before we can disembark. Then the Plague Marines have to emergency disembark, and they can do so in the 3 inches. But we probably took some casualties here. And then when it's our phase, we can still move our Plague Marines 5 inches in our turn, so they can, practically, they can go the same distance as the good scenario where the Rhino is not destroyed, let's say. But they could still, in our turn 2, we could still threaten something that was 30 inches. If we can charge at something, we can have moved our Plague Marines in a bigger distance. But here the Rhino has been destroyed in the meantime, and we have probably lost a few Plague Marines. The alternative to all of this is that we, for example, don't have the Rhino. We just let the Plague Marines foot slog along, and in this case we advance the Plague Marines in the first turn, so they can only move 5 inches, and a D6 for advance roll, we would on average move 8.5 inches, and then in the second turn we could do a normal move because we might want to make a charge after that. We will be on average 13.5 inches, so we will probably be only halfway up the board, and then we could come to where we want in the middle of the board, let's say, but we wouldn't be we wouldn't be able to come to the opponent's, let's say, deployment zone in the second turn. If we add the Noxious Blightbringer, he gives 1 inch movement and 1 inch advance more, let's say, for the Marines. So they would be a bit, let's say, 2 inches further away on average if we include the Noxious Blightbringer for 60 points. And here I've tried to illustrate here the green with, if we have the Rhino, for example, it could move, and in the second turn the Plague Marines could be at 23.5 inch from the start point, so they are very close to the opponent's deployment zone, and then they can charge, let's say 7, 8, whatever inches we want, and come to the opponent's zone, making damage and maybe contesting. If we did it here, we could contest the backfield objectives of the opponents with our Plague Marines. If the blue arrows shows the distance roughly, if we only foot slog along, we advance, then we move, and then we are here in the middle, and then we can maybe charge something here in the middle, maybe contesting some of these objectives. And if we have the Noxious Blightbringer, we can go a little bit further than if we didn't have him. So if the Rhino survives the first turn, it has the potential to deliver the Plague Marines close to charge into into the enemy deployment zone if we want that. The Rhino scenario costs 80 points here, so it's the equivalent of having 3 or 4 Plague Marines more on the table, or 16 Poxwalkers. So it costs quite considerably. We could have a bit more troops on the table. Without the Rhino, the foot slogging Plague Marines can reach the middle ish in turn 2 and charge there. And maybe in this case, we just try to leave the backfield for our Terminators. Alternatives for this is also we could have the Plague Marines as strategic reserves, but then we have to pay command points. They can only arrive from the edges here, not in the enemy deployment zone, 9 inches away from any maybe screening unit. And we need to make a 9-inch charge. And of course we have the Terax drill or other transport options, which I will cover in another video. So what could the Rhino do after a successful transportation of the Plague Marines? Of course, it could spread the contagion. So we can, after delivering the Plague Marines, we can press on forward and use Flash Outbreak on the Rhino. As I said, it's the fastest contagion Plague Company unit in Death Guard, except the Greater Blight Drone. If undamaged and unbracketed, it could reach 30 inches with 2 advances, 1 advance and then disembark and then advance again in turn 2. The Flash Outbreak in this case would give it a 6-inch aura in that turn, and it will have the -1 toughness contagion plus copying the Warlord contagion from this Plague Company, for example, if we had a Ferric Blight Warlord or a Gloaming Bloat, etc. So it could put, let's say, enemies within the opponent's area. They could suffer contagions and benefit our other units, so like a forward tagging contagion unit. It also can help us score secondaries, especially being a Bubonic Astartes. So we have the Despoiled Ground Death Guard secondary, which is of course end of battle. So if we have the Rhino covering some table quarter or being in the enemy deployment zone, it helps us score secondaries. Or we have contagion range and within 3 inches of objectives, it could help us score some points, but then of course it has to survive the whole battle. Engage on all fronts, of course, can also help, where we have the Chaos Rhino can just go and stand in a corner, let's say, or do line breaker being in the, let's say, in the enemy's deployment zone. But can it survive long enough to first of all make its primary role to deliver the Plague Marines and then score the secondaries and do a lot of fun here? So that brings us to the Rhino's durability. So in this table, I'm summarizing the shots it takes on average to destroy a Rhino, not point corrected. And as we can see here, we have a variety of weapons. Here it's more light arms fire. And down here we have the heavier anti-vehicle weapons. And we can see that the Chaos Rhino is susceptible to anti-vehicle weapons as expected. So a couple of Melta shots will most certainly degrade it and maybe even destroy it. So here we see, for example, if we have Meltas at half range, we only need 4 shots on average to take out the Rhino, but only, let's say, two on average needed to remove 5 wounds and make it only 6-inch move, thus hampering its utility. But the Chaos Rhino has the smoke screen, so it can help increase the durability and can be used even in turn 1 in the opponent's shooting phase, let's say. So in this case, we will be able to take 33%. We will be able to take 33% more shots on average before being destroyed. So we have a little bit more chance of the opponent missing. And of course, a degraded 6-inch move Rhino is hardly useful to transport 5-inch move infantry. Then it's basically worthless to do so. So it's very dangerous, and especially if the Rhino is in the forward position after it has driven up, then a lot of enemy units could come close by and shoot it with these close range or half range Melta weapons, for example. But it would be, for example, it could degrade if we have a 5-man Hellblaster squad shooting 10 supercharged shots. Here with supercharged shots, even with a smoke screen, it would degrade. We would, on average, let's say, lose 5 wounds. eradicators, attack bikes with multi-meltas. Attack bikes can move fast up and maybe come to half range. Shooting with multi-meltas, they will be doing damage regardless of the smoke screen. And so basically heavy shots will degrade it and take it out. So the question is if we can hide it long enough and utilize terrain or saturate the opponent with more threatening targets. For example, if we have a Mortarion, then maybe these units wouldn't focus on the Rhino, and then the Rhino can do its job while Mortarion is doing his thing, for example, and they have to focus on him. So summarizing a little bit the Rhino, the Sunshine scenario, the best thing, of course, if we win the first turn or we hide the Rhino in the beginning, there is some obscuring terrain so that the opponent cannot shoot it. We can move it up or advance it up. And here again, where we place it here is important. If we can keep it, let's say, obscured or not easily targetable, and we can use smoke screen, then in our next turn, having survived, we can disembark, we can move 3 inches, we can move 5 inches, we can charge with Plague Marines, and then the Rhino can continue spreading contagion or doing to score secondary. So that's of course the optimal use, but I think it would probably require us to use the terrain as much as possible here. And then of course not as good is that if we win first turn, we move it up, or if the opponent could not shoot us in the first turn, but after we move up, we are probably more exposed. And here also the opponent can come at half range and destroy maybe, or bracket, or destroy the Rhino. We have to emergency disembark our Plague Marines, we suffer casualties, etc. And then the worst scenario, of course, is if the opponent gets first turn and destroys the loaded Rhino here already, and the content emergency disembarks, we lose 1-2 models on average. Disembarking, it could be much more. And in this case, we basically lost 80 points of the Rhino and 40-ish points from the content without any gain. Basically, we are at the starting line, and we could have foot slog with more models if we didn't get the Rhino. But okay, even in this case, the Rhino took some shots that something else didn't get shot, for example, blow drones or Demon Prince or something like this. So summarizing on the Rhino tactics, I think if we get turn 1, then we will be able to disembark the Plague Marines close to the middle of the table so they can do their thing, or they can start the disembarkation there. One way to avoid the really bad scenario of getting it blown away in turn 1 or heavily degraded is if our opponent gets the first turn, maybe not to have the units starting inside the Rhino. Here we can have the infantry deployed close to the Rhino, and if the Rhino survives the first turn, then we can embark at the beginning of our turn, and then the Rhino can move off and we can do our strategy from there. But we don't put our eggs in the basket until we see that the basket has survived the first turn. Of course, as I said, always try to utilize terrain to keep the Rhino obscured and protected as much as possible, especially when it's loaded, because then it's also a high value target. A niche use could be to utilize the Rhino empty, maybe as a cheap way, as the 80 point. It's a cheap way to get a fast 12-inch movement with Contagions quickly up the field to spread Contagions with a flash outbreak. And I think you would probably want to use it to transport the Plague Marines. The alternative, of course, to all of this is that we just skip the Rhino, we add more Marines, we foot slog the Marines, and the Plague Marines then, their target is to take the center and use deep striking Terminators to contest the backfield and to try to do some damage there, and not hoping to advance the Plague Marine so far until later in the game maybe. Or of course it could be something with the Terrax Assault Drill. So some summary and final thoughts. Rhinos are the cheapest transport for bringing out Plague Marines quickly upfield. They are our fastest Plague Company unit with Contagions of Nurgle, apart from the Greater Blight Drone. And this is we need also a bit clarification now on the Forge World models on the Imperial Armor Compendium, because before it had the Nurgle's Gift, but I think now I've seen that it has been rewritten as Contagions of Nurgle also for the Greater Blight Drone. The Rhino's durability is an issue, as I said, toughness 7, 10 wounds and no inval save, and its movement can bracket, which is basically its movement is its best characteristic or its more important characteristic, and it can bracket after 5 wounds, and this can happen after a couple of shots with the Meltas, unfortunately. It has the smoke screen, which can help, but however, these heavy weapons are bad news for our Rhino. In order to keep the Rhino operational, we probably need to use terrain and obscuring features to our advantage. And if successful, in the best use scenario, it can deliver its payload of Plague Marines close to the opponent's deployment zone in turn 2, where they can charge the enemy and do a lot of damage. Our Plague Marines can really do a lot if they can be, if for example, 10-man unit of Plague Marines can do severe damage if they can come upfield before being shot at, etc. The Rhino, in this best scenario, can then continue spreading contagions, helping our other units buff their damage and score, help us scoring secondaries point to win us the game eventually. But however, it could be equally useful to go for the other, let's say, go for the other idea is to foot slog the Marines to the middle of the ground, leave the backfield more for the Terminators, and save the cost for the Rhino. So this concludes this video. What are your thoughts of the Rhino? Have you been successful in using it in the 9th? And have you been able to utilize its potential to score secondaries and the potential to spread contagions and be target for the flash outbreak? So leave some comments. If you like this video, please press like and subscribe to the channel, where I will be bringing you more content of Death Card tactics and unit reviews and Math Hammer things. If you want to further support my efforts, please visit the Patreon page, my Patreon page, patreon.com/GeneralYanis, to help and support the activity of the channel going forward. And with these words, General Yanis is signing out. Stay safe out there, and bye-bye.